How do you explain a toast meant to be funny that froze a wedding room in seconds? I joked about which of Declan's friends had flirted with me before the vows. My husband heard every word, and our first night ended with him locking himself in the bathroom. My name is Verity Ashcroft Lund, and I am 31 years old, and I work as a freelance brand consultant, which means I help companies figure out the story they want to tell the world, and then I write it for them in ways that make people pay attention. I have always been good at stories. I have always been good at rooms. I am the kind of person who walks into a gathering and finds the current of it within 5 minutes, where the energy is, who is waiting to laugh, what the evening wants to become. And I have spent most of my adult life being told that this quality is rare and good, and that I should not waste it on people who cannot keep up. I believed that. I still believed it the night of the wedding, when I stood up in the grand ballroom with a champagne flute in one hand and a card of notes I did not need in the other, and said the thing that I had been planning to say for 2 weeks because I thought it would be the moment everyone remembered. Declan Ashcroft Lund is 33, a civil structural engineer, the kind of person who reads the same paragraph 3 times before accepting it as fact, and who once rebuilt a broken chair from raw timber because replacing it felt wasteful. We had been together for 3 years before the wedding, and I had chosen him from several options, which is not a cruel thing to say. It is simply true, and I have always believed that honesty is more useful than performance. He is quiet in the way that some people are before they decide something, and at the time of the wedding I was still reading that quietness as patience. The grand ballroom held 92 guests. It had 3 tiers of round tables in ivory linen, a low stage for the band, and a cocktail-hour string quartet winding down as dinner was served. I had planned every detail of the room, the floral arches, the seat assignments, the seating of families so that the right conversations would happen naturally. I knew exactly where Declan was standing when I rose. He was at the back near the beverage station, glass of sparkling water in hand, because he was driving several older guests home that evening, talking to his uncle with the ease of a man who is comfortable in his own family. The toast started exactly as I rehearsed it. I thanked the venue, the families, the bridesmaids. I told the story about the morning early in our relationship when I burned actual toast, bread, in a toaster, and Declan made me breakfast from scratch without being asked, and I thought then that this was a person worth keeping. The room laughed warmly and lifted their glasses. Then I made the pivot I had been looking forward to all week. I said that before Declan proposed I had conducted a private survey of his friend group and that I wanted the record to show that at least 2 of them had made their interest in me very clear before I chose Declan. And I named Fletcher specifically, saying that Fletcher had, in my words, definitely had a chance. I said it with a laugh and raised my glass higher and said I had chosen the right man. The room did not laugh. There was a silence of maybe 3 seconds, which at a wedding is a very long time, and then a scatter of uncomfortable sound and one nervous cough near the left windows. Fletcher's wife, Neve, set her fork down on her plate with a small clink. Fletcher sat with his right hand flat on the tablecloth and his jaw very controlled. At the back of the room, Declan had stopped talking to his uncle. He was looking at me with the specific expression of someone who has understood something they would have preferred not to understand. Margot, his mother, set her champagne flute down and turned it face away. The band's drummer started a soft rim fill to break the quiet. My maid of honour, Cressida, began applauding before anyone else, and 4 or 5 guests followed, but the room had already shifted temperature. I sat back down and told Cressida that people were simply not ready for that much honesty at a wedding, and she said something vague and filled her own glass. The next 40 minutes was surface-level ordinary, food, music, polite conversation. But I began to notice small things I could not quite interpret. Fletcher not looking at me through the main course. Neve speaking quietly to the woman beside her. Declan's sister, Saoirse, sitting with her eyes fixed on the tablecloth since the toast. When Declan returned to the head table, he said nothing about the speech. He cut his food into careful pieces and ate in measured silence. I tried to squeeze his hand under the table and he did not pull away, but he did not respond either. His hand stayed where it was, neutral and still. After the cake cutting, Declan moved us briefly toward a corridor near the coat check alcove, a narrow hall with a wallpapered column and a row of numbered hooks. The string quartet was packing its cases nearby, and the low sound of metal clasps snapping filled the space. He spoke quietly and without any performance in his voice at all. He said he had one question and wanted a real answer. He asked what outcome I had expected when I named Fletcher specifically in a room of 92 people that included Fletcher's wife, his own mother, and 3 senior colleagues from his firm. He said the question was not about jealousy. He was asking what I had imagined the room would feel like for Fletcher and for him in the seconds after I said it. I felt a flare of irritation rise and told him he was being fragile on his own wedding night, that the toast was a compliment because I was saying I chose him above everyone else, and that if he could not see that the problem was his reading of the room and not my words. I said Fletcher was a grown man who could handle a joke. Declan looked at me for a long moment and said that Fletcher was also a married man whose wife was currently sitting inside not speaking, and that he would like me to consider what Niamh was experiencing. I said Niamh had always been overly sensitive and we would all laugh about it later. He said quietly that he did not think we would. He offered to go speak to Fletcher and Niamh together right then, before the evening ended, to apologise on both their behalf. I refused, saying it would only make the moment bigger and more memorable. He nodded once, slowly, in a way that did not mean agreement, and said he would let it go for tonight. The word tonight felt very small and very specific. At 11:47 that night, in the coat check alcove, Niamh collected her wrap and dictated a voice note to her sister. She was furious, controlled, precise, describing exactly what I said and exactly what she saw on Fletcher's face when his name was announced across a full ballroom. She hit send. The contact her phone auto-completed was not her sister. It was Saoirse Ashcroft, whose name sat one position above in her recent list because they had coordinated the flower pickups that morning. Niamh did not realise the error. She collected her wrap and went to find Fletcher. Saoirse was standing in the hotel corridor near the elevator bank when her phone vibrated with the audio. She stepped aside, pulled an earbud from her clutch, and pressed play. Her face moved through the 63-second recording, from confused to understanding to something more careful and deliberate. She pressed save. She labelled the file with the date. She looked up, and Declan was 8 feet away, checking something on his phone. She did not show him the audio that night. She simply put her phone away and kept it. In the hotel suite on the 9th floor, the champagne sat untouched in a bucket of fully melted ice. Declan sat in the armchair near the window in his dress shirt, looking at the city. When I woke at 3 a.m, the armchair was empty and the bathroom door was closed. He was on the other side of it. I lay in the middle of the bed and looked at the champagne bottle and did not open it. We returned from a 4-day honeymoon, a coastal town, chosen short because Declan had a project deadline the following Monday. And the drive home was quiet in a way that had texture now, unlike the pre-wedding quiet. He answered every question I asked in full, complete sentences, but his responses did not meander. They did not veer into the kind of comfortable conversational sprawl that used to fill our long drives. I told myself he was tired. I told myself the toast was already becoming background noise in the way that embarrassing moments do when enough ordinary life passes over them. Back in the apartment, I noticed that the mail stack on the side table had been reorganised, his pile and mine separated, which had never happened before. His pile had a bank statement with a yellow post-it note folded inward. I did not ask about it. I returned to my freelance schedule that week, took meetings at my co-working space downtown, and convinced myself that everything was moving back toward normal. At the co-working space, I shared a hot-desking row with a rotating roster of freelancers, and one of them was Rory Tate, a graphic designer who had been in the same row for 3 months. We had been exchanging messages since before the wedding, observations about the office, shared frustration about difficult clients, the easy back and forth of two people who immediately find each other's rhythm. Before the wedding, I told myself it was networking. After the honeymoon, I told myself it was friendship. The difference I could not articulate was that I checked his messages before I checked anything else each morning, and that I had not mentioned his name to Declan because I had decided there was nothing to mention. And I understood somewhere quiet that silence and secrecy are entirely different things, but I did not want to stand in the gap between them for long enough to see clearly. The first week back, Rory suggested lunch at the Riverside Terrace Cafe. Wooden outdoor decking, a view of the water, menu boards in chalk. I said yes immediately and did not tell Declan, reasoning that it was a work lunch and I did not narrate every professional interaction. At the cafe, Rory made me laugh in the specific way I had begun to miss at home, and a mutual follower from the co-working space, someone with a public account, tagged our table in a story. The image showed me in profile, laughing, Rory's sleeve visible at the frame's edge. A small detail visible in the image's lower corner showed 2 wine glasses and the edge of a 2-hour checkout receipt. A mutual contact of Declan's reshared it before I had looked at my notifications once. On a Wednesday evening, Declan sat with me in the living room after dinner with his phone screen down on his knee. He said that a mutual contact had forwarded him a reshared story and he showed me the post, my profile, the wine glasses, the receipt edge, the timestamp reading 12:45. He said he wanted to know who the person was. I told him it was Rory, someone from the co-working space, and that we had been reviewing a mutual client brief over lunch and it was nothing. Declan nodded and then asked the specific question I did not want to answer. He said the image showed 2 rounds of drinks and a receipt suggesting 2 hours at a Riverside restaurant, and he asked what part of a client review required that combination on a Tuesday afternoon with someone whose name he had never heard in any previous conversation we had about work. He said he was not asking to punish me. He was asking because those 3 things together, on top of the unexplained schedule changes that week, made him want to understand what was actually happening. He said a clear answer would make everything easy. I felt the conversation narrow. I told him the receipt was for a shared table and other items belonged to other customers, that a 2-hour working lunch was normal in creative fields. And then I flipped the question back. I said his behaviour since the wedding had been cold and withdrawn, and I was beginning to wonder if he was manufacturing suspicion about my friendships to justify his own distance from me. I said I felt unsafe in this dynamic. He did not react to that. He waited and then asked one more thing. Whether I would be comfortable introducing Rory to him at any point, the way I had introduced other colleagues in the past. He said if I said yes, he would leave it completely alone. I said I would arrange it when schedules aligned. He said okay. He picked up a book. He did not close the conversation with anger. He closed it with the patience of someone who had already started measuring. 3 days after the honeymoon return, Declan had left for work slightly early and returned 2 hours after his project schedule required without explanation. That evening, I came home to find the household binder open on the dining table, a worn blue binder with tabs labelled by utility, and a small notepad beside it with 2 lines of even script I could not read before he closed it and moved it to his work satchel. The next morning I found that the joint account's security PIN had changed. He shared the new number over dinner that evening. Unremarkable. But the notepad page was in the pocket of his satchel rather than on the desk where he usually left notes. His phone alarm went off at 7 on Thursday morning. The label visible on the screen for 2 seconds before it locked read, East Park Office, 11 a.m. He dismissed it with one thumb swipe and set the phone face down beside the coffee maker. I tried to open his calendar app later that morning and found he had added a personal calendar within the shared app that was visible only to him. The shared calendar showed nothing unusual. The personal calendar showed a small grey lock icon beside its name. I closed the app and poured a second coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the street below and told myself, very firmly, that this was nothing at all. Fletcher and Neve had a narrow terraced garden behind their row house. String lights between the fence posts, a gas grill, a fold-out table that could seat 10 if everyone angled their chairs. The invitation was for 8, the two of them, Declan and me, another couple from Declan's university years named Paul and Gemma, and a mutual friend named Gareth, who was single, loud, and worked in commercial radio and had known Declan since his 20s. I had arrived slightly ahead of the dinner's energy. Cressida and I had had an earlier social call that ran long, and I felt the particular bright-edged confidence that comes from being already warmed up when the room is still cold. Neve greeted me at the garden gate with a hug that was brief and correct. Fletcher shook Declan's hand with the warmth of genuine old friends. The grill began to smoke. Gareth told a story about a drive time segment that went entirely wrong. Paul and Gemma argued companionably about directions. Declan stood near the grill helping Fletcher with the skewers, their voices low and separate from the group, and I watched this from across the garden and had the same feeling I had been having since the honeymoon. There was a version of Declan that existed in this circle that I was not fully admitted to, a warmth that was specifically his and not ours as a couple. I moved toward Gareth, and we fell easily into conversation, a fast rhythm of observation and joke-making that Gareth matched without effort. When Fletcher called everyone to the table, I sat beside Gareth rather than Declan, and the seating left Declan at the far end with Paul and Gemma for the entire meal. This did not feel like a decision. It felt natural. Midway through the main course, Gareth made a remark, meant as a compliment in our table's register, that Declan must be relieved to have someone as lively as me to compensate for his quietness. I took the opening and ran with it. I said that someone had to keep things interesting, that Declan was wonderful, but that I sometimes thought I should charge admission to their dinner parties because I was doing most of the social work. I laughed when I said it. Gareth laughed too. Paul and Gemma smiled uncertainly. Fletcher looked directly at Declan at the far end of the table. Niamh refilled her own wineglass and did not reach for mine. Declan had heard. The garden was not large, and he did not react visibly. He turned to Paul and asked a question about a house renovation, and the conversation current shifted toward that. He had redirected the table away from the moment without drawing attention to it, which I registered only as the Gareth thread winding down. The taxi ride home was quiet. Back at our building, in the stairwell between the 3rd and 4th floors, Declan stopped walking. The motion sensor light clicked on and held. He turned to me. He asked me to describe in my own words what I had said at the garden table about social lifting. He said he wanted to hear how I framed it because he had heard it from the far end of the table and wanted to be sure he understood correctly. He noted the specific detail of the seating, that I had chosen to sit beside Gareth and the arrangement had left him at the opposite end for the entire meal, and asked whether that had been intentional, and if so, what he thought it communicated to Fletcher and Neve about how I felt about being at a table with him. I told him the seating was random, and that once the conversation started moving, it would have been rude to shift. I said the remark about social lifting was a joke that Gareth had found funny, which proved the room was fine with it. I added that if he was upset about a dinner party seating arrangement, I was genuinely concerned about his capacity for proportion. The motion sensor light cut out, then clicked back on. In the renewed brightness, Declan said something more direct. He said that the wedding toast had named Fletcher in front of Fletcher's wife and 92 guests, and that tonight's remark had described him as passive and socially invisible in front of the same social group, and that 2 public incidents of the same kind, with the same witnesses, was not a joke. It was a pattern, and a pattern required a response. He said he was not asking her to change her personality. He was asking whether she understood what those moments meant for his dignity his friendships, and how the people who knew him before her now understood the marriage. He said, clearly and without emotion, that he was offering one more time to attend a couple's session together, to work through this with someone who could help them both be heard. I told him the session was unnecessary because the problem was not in the marriage, but in his refusal to accept that I communicated differently than he did. I said calling a dinner party remark a pattern was a way of framing my personality as a character flaw, and I found that exhausting and unkind. I said if he wanted to work with a therapist, he could go alone and address his insecurity there. The light cut out again. We stood in the dark for a moment before the sensor reset. Declan said okay and continued up the stairs. As the guests were leaving Fletcher's garden, Neve had taken a photo of the outdoor table, the string lights and half-empty glasses making a clean image. She angled it toward the near end of the table. In the background, soft and out of focus, Declan sat with his hands flat on the table, his gaze in the middle distance, his face carrying an expression she had not meant to capture and chose not to post. In the taxi home, I checked my phone and found a direct message from Gareth's partner, Steph, who I had met once at a birthday gathering. The message was careful and polite and asked what exactly had been said at the dinner tonight and whether I had meant it the way it came across. It was the kind of message that had already formed its own conclusion and was simply waiting for confirmation. Margot Ashcroft's house was a semi-detached on a quiet residential road with bay windows and a dining room table that seated 8 comfortably. The table was set for 6 that Sunday. Margot, Saoirse, Declan, me, and 2 long-standing family friends who had known Declan since he was a child, building things in Margot's back garden. The meal started without difficulty. Margot asked Declan about a project at work, the family friends asked about my consultancy business, and I gave a capable account of it. And for the first 20 minutes, the table had the warm, easy rhythm of people who share a long history. Midway through the main course, Margot mentioned a pergola Declan had built years ago in this very garden, and said it had taken him 3 weekends of careful work, and he had never once complained about the pace of it. The comment was affectionate and maternal. I took it and turned it lightly. I said that careful and slow were essentially the same quality, and that I had started thinking of Declan's pace at home as one of life's more educational experiences. I smiled when I said it. One of the family friends offered a polite sound. Margot set her fork down and looked at me with a clear, direct attention that held no warmth whatsoever, and then she turned to Saoirse and asked a different question entirely. She did not address me directly again for the rest of the meal. In the car home, Declan asked quietly whether I understood what had happened at the table. I told him Margot had taken a light-hearted remark too personally. He said the remark had described him as slow and domestically inadequate in front of people who had known him for 25 years, and that Margot had heard it the same way he did. He offered again, and he said this was the 3rd time he was doing so, to sit together with someone neutral, a counsellor, or a trusted friend they both respected, to talk through how our communication was landing in social situations. He said he would not offer this a 4th time. I told him I did not need a mediator to tell me I was a good communicator. I looked out the window. He did not pursue it further. That afternoon, I drove to my mother Priscilla's house, sat at her kitchen breakfast bar, and told her my version of the past several weeks. I started with the wedding toast, which I described as a moment of honesty that the room misread, and moved forward through the garden dinner and that morning's lunch with Margot. By the time I finished, I had built a coherent and believable shape. I was a woman of energy and directness, surrounded by a family that could not accept her, married to a man who was growing cold and controlling, gradually isolated by a mother-in-law who had decided to treat her as a threat. Priscilla is supportive in the way that Priscilla always has been, and she said that Margot sounded difficult and that Declan needed to stand up for his wife more confidently. She was moving toward agreement, and then she asked one question, sideways and out of nowhere, that stopped me. She asked whether Declan had ever actually been unkind to me. Not distant, not quiet, unkind. I thought about it for longer than I should have and said that his coldness was a form of unkindness. Priscilla nodded. But there was something in her expression, not disagreement, not quite skepticism, something smaller and more honest, that told me she had heard the hesitation before my answer and that she was holding it somewhere privately. That evening, stung by Margot's silence and by a family gathering that had felt like a verdict, I posted to my Instagram story a photo of a sunset taken from the car window captioned, "Being yourself around people who can't handle your energy is the bravest thing." A second slide followed, a selfie, bright and composed, with the caption, "No apologies for knowing who you are." Cressida had called 2 hours earlier and asked me carefully, given the weekend's events, to stay off social media and let things settle. I told her I would think about it and posted 40 minutes later. Margot saw it. Saoirse saw it and took a screenshot and added it to a folder on her phone beside Neve's wedding night audio and the garden photo she had kept without posting. Fletcher saw it. Neve saw it and did not reply. Cressida saw it and did not respond at all, which was its own kind of answer. When I returned home from Priscilla's, Declan was in the apartment making dinner. On the hallway shelf beside the coat hooks sat a slim new folder with a printed spine reading Household Current. It had not been there that morning. I opened it. The lease copy, utility account numbers, the joint banking agreement, a printed page of shared subscriptions with columns of dates and amounts, all organised and tabbed. Everything in it was ordinary, all of it ours. But the spine had been printed somewhere else, on a different printer than ours, and the tabs were the kind that come in packs from an office supplies store. Someone had assembled this somewhere other than this hallway. I closed the folder and replaced it at the exact angle I had found it, and did not ask about it because I could not frame a question that did not reveal what I was afraid the answer might be. That night, Saoirse's name lit up on Declan's phone across the kitchen counter. He read the message, typed a brief reply, and set the phone face down beside the sink. He asked about my afternoon at Priscilla's, and I said it was fine. We ate dinner and washed up, and he was present and polite, and the evening had not one argument in it, which was the wrong kind of peace. Rory pulled back by degrees. Messages slowed from immediate to delayed to occasional, from warm to efficient. When I asked why he'd gone quiet, he mentioned that his brother Owen had brought up a structural engineer named Declan Ashcroft in a contractor meeting. He didn't say what this meant. He didn't need to. Over 10 days, he simply slowed to a stop, and the last message I sent was answered 6 hours later with a thumbs-up emoji. His bag was gone from the co-working desk when I came out of the phone booth where I'd spent 12 minutes sitting without making a call. At the dry cleaner on a Thursday afternoon, Declan and I arrived at the counter at the same moment. He turned to me before I could fill the air with something ordinary. He said he'd been thinking about the weekend with his mother, about Fletcher's dinner, about the wedding. He referenced Steph's direct message, the one sent after the garden dinner, and said he knew about it because Gareth had told Fletcher and Fletcher had told him. A person who barely knew us had privately questioned our marriage based on what she witnessed at a single dinner party. He asked one question. What did I think the people at the wedding, at Fletcher's garden, and at the Sunday lunch now understood about the marriage? Not what I intended, but what they had actually seen. My refusal was the sharpest I'd given him. I said he was using other people's discomfort as a weapon, that it wasn't my job to manage the interpretations of people who couldn't handle a woman with a clear sense of herself. I collected my dress, paid, and walked out. He came out behind me, thanked the counter staff, and walked in the other direction without hurrying. That evening, I sat beside him on the sofa with the deliberate warmth of someone who has thought carefully about how to sound undeliberate. I suggested a reset, a coastal weekend, the kind of trip we used to take. I said I wanted to come back to who we were. Declan asked 2 questions. First, what specifically I planned to do differently about public remarks, not in general terms but practically. I said I planned to be more mindful. He nodded and asked whether the weekend was something I wanted, because I believed things needed to change, or because I could sense he was at a point of decision and wanted to slow it down. His voice was not unkind. The question was exact. I told him that wasn't fair. He said he understood, picked up his book, and the conversation was over before I could find another way in. The next afternoon, I heard the step stool pulled from the kitchen cupboard, then the soft thud of something placed on a high shelf. The flat grey filing box that had lived under the study desk, shared documents, lease notices, insurance cards, was gone. I found it in the hallway closet top shelf, tidily placed between the spare duvet and a box of seasonal items. I closed the closet and did not ask him about it. 3 days later, I saw Declan through the glass doors of our wedding hotel, collecting a small envelope from the concierge desk. He folded it into his breast pocket without looking inside and left through the side exit without glancing toward the street. I told myself it was a parking receipt and that there was nothing to ask. That evening, his phone lit up with a call from a contact labelled with a building logo emoji. He declined it, scrolled the thread, and set the phone face down. Before the screen locked, I caught 3 words: confirmed, Thursday, and a time. He looked up and said he'd been thinking and was going to handle things properly from here. His tone was not a threat and not an invitation to respond. He refilled his water glass and returned to his plate. I told myself I would ask in the morning what he meant. There was no morning that looked like what I was picturing when I thought that. I came through the revolving door at 10:47 on a Thursday morning, carrying Declan's laptop charger in a tote bag. A woman in a grey suit jacket was waiting at the reception desk. She said my name, not as a question, and handed me a clipped set of documents with coloured tabs. No theatre, no scene. Just me holding a laptop charger, receiving papers I hadn't expected, in a building I'd come to myself. I sat in the lobby and read. The first document was a defamation complaint retained by Declan, naming 3 incidents. The wedding toast where I'd identified Fletcher Osei by name in front of 92 guests. The Instagram story posted after Cressida explicitly asked me not to. And the garden dinner remark about social lifting, documented by Steph's written account. Every piece of supporting evidence, Neve's time-stamped voice note, Sausha's screenshot, Steph's forwarded message, was something I had done publicly, on a platform, or in a room full of witnesses. The settlement required retractions, a written apology, and silence. The alternative was civil filing. The second document was a petition for financial separation, joint accounts divided, a motion for temporary exclusive use of the apartment, first hearing the following Thursday. The 3 words I'd read on his phone screen the night before had not been about a work meeting. Declan had not manufactured any of it. He had simply collected what I had put into the world while I was convinced that saying things loudly was a form of power. I called Cressida. She said she could not be involved, that this was no longer a misunderstanding. She hung up. I called Priscilla, who said she'd been thinking about the one question she'd asked me, whether Declan had ever actually been unkind, and that my hesitation had not left her. She would help me find somewhere to stay. She could not help me win this argument. She did not think there was one to win. I left the charger at reception for Declan and walked out. What I thought gave me power, the public naming, the defiant post, the dinner table performance, was the exact architecture used to document the pattern. Every moment I couldn't tolerate going unnoticed had created a record. I had not been silenced. I had been documented. The apartment reverted to Declan within 7 days. I moved my boxes to Priscilla's spare room in 2 trips, the second in the rain. The joint card declined at the petrol pump on Wednesday. Both Instagram posts came down, and the space where they'd been was simply nothing. The apology reached Fletcher and Neve. Neither replied. Cressida sent one message hoping I was okay and did not wait for an answer. 3 weeks later, I sat on a northbound metro platform in the early quiet, holding a phone with no new notifications. The train arrived. I got on.